the China Challenge. And moderating this is Laura Kelly with the Hill, an influential media outlet in the United States. Laura, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, everyone can hear me all right? Okay, I just want to start off maybe asking a question to the audience. How many in the audience is their job is working on China? China policy is some aspect of their job. 1, 2. I have 2 people, really? Okay. And how many people in the audience have been to China maybe in the past 10 years? Okay, that's a good amount. And how about in the past 5 years? Okay, good amount. And how many people think that the US should defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese aggression? Okay, a lot of hands. So just starting out on that note, I'll go to our panel. We have Hiroyuki Akita. He's a columnist journalist for Nikkei-Japan. We have Bobo Lobo. He's an independent analyst, a lot of focus on Sino-Russia relations. And we have Igor Khrestin from the Bush Institute. And I just want to start out one question with Hiro. From Japan's perspective, if China was to attack Taiwan militarily, and would China want the US to defend Taiwan? Is Japan prepared for US taking such action? Japan has taken steps to have counter-strike capabilities, but, and then just one more, Admiral Davidson in the US said that Chinese President Xi Jinping wants to be prepared to take over Taiwan militarily by 2027. That is not so far away. So where does Japan stand in that regard?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. And on the Taiwan question, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida said that one day after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, he said, today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's East Asia. And he didn't elaborate further than that, but he meant that if there were to be a long war in Ukraine, potentially spread to Europe, it is likely that Asia will be more dangerous because US have military capability to fight only one major war. It maintained 2 major war capability, but not anymore. So in that context, Japan was alarmed when Russia invaded Ukraine, and then made a very historic decision. That is to increase defense budget, double defense budget by 2027. And Japan assumed that if there were to be an attack from China to Taiwan, whether Japan will like or not, Japan will get involved. Because this island chain is so close to Taiwan. So naturally, it will be a theater. And also, if US involved, if US will not involve, it is game over. Taiwan will be China's military base. That will have a huge geostrategic impact in a negative way. But if US intervene, US will use US base in Japan. And Japan will, of course, I'm sure that Japan will, allow US to use it. So technically speaking, China will attack Japan, Japanese US base, and also Japanese military base to prevent US and Japan to help Taiwan, to protect Taiwan. So based on that assumption, Japan is doubling defense budget, and also Japan made a decision to introduce robust offensive capability, specifically introducing long-range ballistic missile for the first time after World War II. So in short, Japan is now launching the biggest military buildup after World War II, because Japan assumed that there could be a Taiwan contingent scenario.
And just quickly to follow up before I go on to my next question, is there support from the Japanese public to continue on this increased kind of defense spending militarization, given that there's going to be a change in leadership in Japan?
So same as in previous session, panelists from Poland said that it is very easy to persuade public.
Okay.
Yeah, so because because of the same reason, according to a poll, more than 60% of Japanese public support to double the defense budget, and also more than 50% support to introduce offensive capability.
Okay, so you know, with the U.S., great for Japan. Without the U.S., bad for Japan, but Japan's still on track to be a front line against China, unfortunately. So I hope I don't sound egotistical or narcissistic. I'm American, and the U.S. election is a pretty big deal. So to Bobo and Igor, let's look at the possibilities of a second Trump administration, a possible Harris administration. It's a change in administration. Bobo, do you want to take kind of the China perspective on, you know, November 6th happens, and what is China thinking on what to do with Trump, or what is China thinking what to do with Harris?
Thanks very much, Laura. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. The Chinese are conflicted about the US presidential election because there are major positives and major negatives to both candidates. So with the Harris administration, let's say, there will be a certain amount of strategic predictability. So the Chinese will more or less know what they're going to get. So it'll be a continuation of the Biden administration's China policy, but perhaps actually slightly less ideological, because there'll be less emphasis, perhaps, at least that's what they think, on the ideology, on the democracy versus autocracy binary.
Less focus.
Less emphasis under a President Harris.
Yes, I agree.
But there are also advantages to a Trump administration for the Chinese. One is that he is a self-styled deal maker. So this will create a kind of personal dynamic that might, from the Chinese perspective, fudge some of the sort of strategic problems in the US-China relationship. Trump will worry less about human rights, at least, again, from a Chinese perspective. Trump might be less committed to defending Taiwan or diluting the one China policy. But there are disadvantages. The problem with Trump is that the Chinese see him as mercurial. So he might do something out of the box that they wouldn't be ready for. And they like a certain amount of strategic continuity and predictability. Trump will, from the Chinese perspective, and this is a positive, he will undermine the transatlantic consensus. He will sow confusion among the enemy, and they want the West to be confused. But also Trump will jack up tariffs. So it's a really complex mix of pluses and minuses to both candidates. I think on balance, possibly a Harris administration is more comfortable for the Chinese because it's more of what they know.
And with Trump, my view is that there will be a lot of domestic chaos, even if, but at the same time, I think that Trump may have some very astute policymakers focused on China.
Sure.
But if the Chinese view that the U.S. is so focused on internal chaos and can't really manage all the foreign policy challenges, what are some of the kind of first steps or first goals that the Chinese are going to focus on? Is it kind of deeper ties with relations in Europe and kind of driving wedges between the U.S. and Europe if the U.S. is distracted, or is China more on Africa, more in the Middle East, more in Central and South America?
Okay, so a couple of quick answers to that. I think with a President Trump, the Chinese would be quite quick to glad hand him. So they'd try and set up a summit because they think that's what ticks Trump's boxes. The Chinese, if let's say Trump becomes wild, or he gives full rein to some of the excesses in his behavior, then the Chinese will play on doubts within Europe, specifically in Paris and Berlin. Less in London, but Paris and Berlin, they'll play on those contradictions. They will try and they will appeal also to Trump's deal-making instincts. So they'll say, can't we do a deal? So we'll ease up on, say, exports of electric vehicles. We will tone down the cyber espionage. But in the meantime, you will give us, you will maybe scale down on freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. So they will definitely look to that kind of deal-making process. So, and I don't think they'll lose much time over it.
Okay, okay. And Igor, if I may turn to you for the American perspective. Let's say Trump comes in the White House or Harris comes in the White House. I think it's fair to say we're going to be looking at a divided Congress. It could go either way, but the House may go to Republicans, the Senate may go to Democrats, vice versa, and that will impede what the president can do and on policy. But remarkably on China, there's a lot of bipartisan support. So regardless, Harris or Trump, what do you see as U.S. policy towards China beginning January 2025?
Well, thank you for having me here. I would agree with Bobo that I think the differences are going to be more tactical than strategic, and more optics about the way that President Trump would approach this than the Harris. But there'll be some, I think, fairly significant continuity on the Hill, and I think it's at this point fairly irreversible, of viewing the China challenge as a societal challenge, right? And so we have this, we've now back to the point where we have a peer competitor. It's been recognized in multiple administrations, including the Trump administration, in their key strategic document as the greatest threat to American primacy in the world. And the Hill is going to take the lead, as it did with, for instance, the CHIPS Act and other sort of elements, to increase America's resilience. And we've been very significantly exposed after COVID, where we've seen that a lot of our pharmaceuticals, a lot of other items. So we're going to focus on friendshoring and nearshoring. We're going to do things, for instance, I personally disagree with, which is, we're going to continue tariffs on Chinese products. But these are the kinds of elements where we have an industrial policy now, which is a very Chinese thing, frankly, to have. But we have it now because we've recognized the scale and scope of the challenge, and it is significant. We have proposals on Capitol Hill now, one released by the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, Roger Wicker, to significantly increase our defense spending. Why our Polish allies are spending 4.2%. America should also spend that much. During the Cold War, we spent 5%. We've lost to China. China has 22 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States right now. It's 22 million tons to 100,000 tons. These are not things that are going to help us in the Taiwan contingency, which, by the way, no war game I've seen does not have the U.S. involved because of the things that Hiro mentioned, which is that our bases are sitting ducks for Chinese missiles in Okinawa and in mainland Japan. And if you're a Chinese war planner, you take out the archers first, before waiting for the arrows, right? And this is the policy we're having debate on Ukraine. So in a Taiwan contingency, U.S. goes to war with China. I think it's almost no scenario I've seen is a scenario of a Chinese landing force, isolated by itself, storming the beaches of Taiwan and the Taiwanese sort of. I don't think that's how it will go down. And we have to be prepared for a two-front fight. And so I think the Congress will be instrumental to that, no matter what the configuration will be. And I think there will be robust debates on how we do that and how we steel ourselves to potentially a two-front fight against a Chinese and a Russian threat. And I'll say on that, one folly of that could be, people in the Trump administration who are so-called Asia firsters, where we will abandon this part of the world because we don't have enough capability in the Indo-Pacific, for a Chinese threat, which is a folly because we may lose this part of the world and not have a significant impact on that part of the world. So I would say that is a cautious element of potential Trump administration. Are people, perhaps the future vice president among them, who would view this part of the world, who would view Ukraine as a secondary theater and prioritize all resources wisely on Indo-Pacific, where we face a much graver, much more longer threat.
Yes, the Trump campaign, or former President Trump, he likes to adopt now peace through strength, talking about how he wants to invest in the military, but he also in his rhetoric doesn't like war. So I imagine that, he said that he'll end the Ukraine war, Russia's war in Ukraine within 24 hours. He tells Israel to get it over with. And so I think there's a lot of doubt of how he would react in a Taiwan contingency. Sorry, I'm using the Japanese terms. Does Chinese President Xi Jinping have an appetite to go for a kinetic war? Or is he, and this can go to anyone. Hiro, do you want to start?
Okay, so I think that, key question is what the China challenge is. And this is the title of this session. And I think this way, Russia challenge we discussed since yesterday. Russia challenge is like a hurricane. Russia wants to hit neighbor and cause a lot of damage. So it's like a hurricane. Maybe North Korea is a cyclone. Smaller scale. But the China challenge is climate change. So China is not hurricane, but it's climate change. So China does not hit you today or tomorrow. But China will use economic power and political power and also military intimidation and also paramilitary operation to change the Western-led order gradually. So I think it is more dangerous than Russia to some extent because hurricane hit and then but maybe it will disappear within years or decades, so Russia will decline. But climate change will cause many, many hurricanes. Climate change will make a mountain fire, and climate change will cause like a flood. So if China will successfully manage to change the climate of this global order, this will mean the risk of simultaneous conflict more and more because hurricane will increase. So maybe war in Ukraine will last for many years, and also there will be more instability in Middle East. And then, of course, there will be more crisis in Asia due to the climate change. So in that context, I think China is supporting Russian Russian aggression in Ukraine, and will never stop doing it because Russia is the only great power partner to promote climate change. So they need Russia, and China cannot afford to embrace the defeat of Putin in Ukraine because China alone cannot promote or accelerate climate change. They need some partner. So I think that from this respect, I think this conference is very important, but also we need to step back and look at the war in Ukraine in the context of the risk of the Third World War.
Okay, on the climate change analogy, I agree with you in the sense that China does want to reshape the international order in a way that's more favorable to it. But from what's been beat into my head, in Washington will say, is that while Russia prefers disorder and chaos in many places around the world so it can do whatever it wants, China doesn't necessarily want disorder and chaos everywhere. It just wants to be able to do what it wants in maybe an orderly fashion. And so I just want to maybe go to Bobo. What do you see of China's ambitions on its remaking of the order in favor to itself, and maybe if you want to bring in its relations with Russia?
Of course. So a lot of people talk, I think, quite casually about an axis of upheaval, as if Russia, China, Iran, North Korea want the same things from international order. My view is a different one. I think that Moscow and Beijing want fundamentally different things from international order. Tobias Ellwood yesterday spoke about China wants to exploit the international order. It doesn't want to own it. China does not want to supplant the existing US-led international order. It wants to distort it, reform it, revise it in ways that advantage Chinese interests at the expense of the United States and the West. That is very different to Russia, which has been described as an arsonist of the international system. Because why does Russia want to overthrow the international order? Because it's a secondary power. And anarchy is a great leveler. And so the more chaotic the global situation is made up of chaotic regional situations, the more scope Russia has to play. Because Russia, although a declining power, remains a formidable, disruptive international actor. Now, what is the nature of the China challenge is quite interesting, because China's challenge is, I think, much less military, although we naturally focus on the military dimension of it. China's challenge to the United States is a multi-dimensional one. I actually think that the real threat to the United States in the longer term is Chinese soft power. Now, right now, that's pretty primitive. They're not good at soft power, but they will get better. And that's something that the United States and the broader West needs to understand. Just quickly on the China-Russia relationship. People talk about this again as an axis, as I mentioned, and they also talk about it being in terms of a vassal relationship. But the Chinese actually look at the Russians in a very different way to the way the Russians look at the Chinese. So the Russians see China as a facilitator, a maximizer of their geopolitical heft around the world. You know, the relationship with China gives Russia real sort of status, at least as viewed from the Kremlin. But the Chinese, actually, they don't so much need active Russian cooperation. They need Russia not to be a pain in the ass. They need Russia not to disrupt Chinese interests. They need Russia to get out of the way. And this is a critical thing about the relationship. Now, on the Ukraine effect, just very quickly, the biggest threat, if Ukraine and the West by extension lose the war in Ukraine, is not that the Chinese are going to launch into a kinetic war in the Indo-Pacific. Actually, the threat's more serious than that. It telegraphs US, European, and broader Western weakness to the entire world. And that gives China much more scope to play, not just in the Indo-Pacific, not just over Taiwan, but really globally. So that's the real threat of Ukraine's defeat.
Can I? Okay.
Go ahead here.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you 90%, but I disagree with you 10%. That is, China's challenge is, China is not using military force, as you say. China wants to exploit from the existing global order. So China is not willing to attack anybody else unless they are necessary. But again, changing global order, climate change will cause lot of destruction, physical destruction. Yeah, and then China is willing to use force. It's necessary, especially in Taiwan Strait, and also in the South China Sea. That is what is happening in South China Sea every day. So I don't think that China's challenge is just a purely political or soft power or whatever, but as a consequence of the China challenge, it may trigger many conflicts and also trigger China's military intervention.
Just very quickly, it's not that, it's a multidimensional challenge, including military.
Yeah.
Look, I have no problem with that thesis. But I don't think China is actively seeking a conflict, not because they're peaceniks.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
No. But they're not looking to militarize to the point of conflict over Taiwan in the South China Sea, because they're genuinely afraid that they'll get
into conflict.
Right.
Yeah,
and they can't afford to lose.
Right, yeah.
If Xi Jinping cannot afford to lose to the United States over Taiwan.
Anyway.
Can I say where this potentially, I agree with this, where this creates some opportunities for the United States? So back to the South China Sea. In 2015, Xi Jinping stood next to President Barack Obama in the White House and promised not to militarize the South China Sea. He militarized the South China Sea. It is now what we fear the Black Sea would become, which is a Russian lake. The South China Sea is Chinese lake, and they've got historical maps. They've got the 9-dash line. U.S. did some things. We continued our freedom of navigation operations, but did nothing to prevent the militarization of the South China Sea. But it created some opportunities for us. First with the Philippines, that took them to UNCLOS and won that case. And we've seen, in the post-Duterte period, the Philippines start to come around and I think realize, and this is one of the Biden administration's, I think, achievements, is to cultivate, a sense in the Philippines that where we, frankly, really desperately need access, because we need to spread our access outside of Japan. So it creates opportunities for us as well to consolidate our allies, the Australians, the Japanese, others, and be able to push back on the Chinese, and I think they'll be receptive to that. And I think that's the hope of avoiding these major cataclysmic global conflicts, that would be economically. I mean, Taiwan Strait, I think is something like 40% of shipborne goods go through there, including other, access points in the South China Sea. It would be devastating to the global economy. Taiwan produces 80% of the world's advanced semiconductors. Nobody wants, the Chinese first and foremost, don't want to see that stop. So there's some ways that it created opportunities for the United States, and we need to embrace those with smart, policies that bring our allies on board and create a bulwark against Chinese expansionism. I would also say 90% agree, 10% disagree. I think if you read some of Xi Jinping's speeches about what he would like to see China become in the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, one can only draw the conclusion that China will supplant the U.S. because that's where it belongs historically, on top. So that would be one minor point of contention there that could become major because it shapes the U.S. debate in the way.
Sure. Wow.
Right. Did you want to add something?
Just very quickly, I think there's a world of difference between being the global power, like the United States is today, and a global power, which is China's aspiration by 2050. The article here really does matter, because what China wants, ultimately, is, I think, a co-primacy with the United States, because I don't think they really believe they can beat the United States. And they, like Tobias was talking about yesterday, they don't want to take responsibility. So they want the status, they want the influence, but responsibility, no thanks.
Thank you guys for that. That was great. Igor, I want to go back to you and get your thoughts on the Biden administration's strategy to deepen ties with allies in the Asia Pacific. And sometimes what the catchphrase is used is like, we're not saying they have to choose between the US and China, but we want them to have the freedom to make choices, which is basically them saying, China's a bad choice and the US is a good choice because it opens you up to all these other, possibilities, and will respect you, China will suppress you, things like that. What's your reaction to that strategy from the Biden administration? Is there, can you bring in like a Republican perspective of maybe what their strategy might be? Maybe there's a difference in rhetoric, because also with the Trump administration, in the first one, they also went around and they laid it out more starkly. Don't do business with China.
Well, I would say that it's, of course, smart to do this, and the Trump administration did the same. I mean, they deepened I think that the Japan relationship was transformed during the Trump administration. I mean, that's an honest assessment of that. Unfortunately, it's missing a very significant, so, you know, to Bobo's point, it's a multifaceted challenge. Security is just one part of it. We have no economic leg of the stool, right? We caught ourselves at the knees in a bipartisan way with walking away from the TPP. Proud to say I worked for a member of the Senate who supported it, you know, and was in the minority because of the political determinants that made our policies, you know, really counterintuitive to our national strategic interests. So what do we bring to the table for our allies? But also, how do we bring others on board? How do we bring the Indonesians on board, for instance? How do we create enough incentives? You know, our traditional allies, I think, will be with us because of the fundamentals of those relationships. You know, we have the cornerstone with Japan. You know, we've got the sort of, you know, we've got the relationship with South Korea that's obviously prefaced on the existential threat they face. Those allies will be with us. The Chinese can come in and do certain things and frankly shoot themselves in the foot a lot of times with those allies. But how do we bring others on board? How do we bring the Malaysians on board? How do we bring the Indonesians on board? How do we work with ASEAN more effectively? Those are the big questions, and that's where I think we're still lacking, and that's where maybe in some ways the sort of, you know, the pivot what we had is still important, even though it's been kind of a failure in a way. But how do we think about these nations? Because the Chinese have a strategy. It's massive economic inducements and other soft power tools and sharp power tools and whatever you have we don't have enough of that. And development, for instance, is one element of that that's completely missing, even though we've taken some steps. You know, we now have the DFC, and it's trying to do things, and we've had these Blue Dot initiative and these sort of, you know, ways where we're saying, well, we'll never bring, you know, the amount of money that the Chinese, but we can bring quality and assurance, and we can bring, you know, so these are the types of things both administrations have to think through because that's an essential part of the China challenge.
Yeah, and I want to kind of bring that in now to what are the Chinese lessons from Russia's war in Ukraine and the U.S. response, European response, Ukraine's response. But in one context, let's see, where do I want to begin? Lessons learned. I guess on the Western unity, and let's start with sanctions. Do the threat of coordinated sanctions possibly against China as they were applied to Russia, now that we're 2.5 years, Russia's war into Ukraine, I mean, do the threat of sanctions on China have any effective deterrence, or what has been proven so far?
Okay,
Hiro,
thank you. So when we read China's literatures, they are learning bad lesson from our perspective and also good lesson from our perspective. So for a good lesson for us is that initially China was kind of surprised because the West, including countries like Japan or even Singapore, reacted and imposed sanctions on Russia. So there was a very quick solidarity and huge sanction against Russia. So also China was shocked that Russia's military performance was so poor.
Yeah.
So they are now reviewing their military plan to annex Taiwan militarily, if necessary. But bad news for us is that recent literatures prove that China is becoming more confident because of mainly two reasons. One, as we look at, so maybe we don't want to use the terminology of global south, but there aren't any other good terminology. So global south, I would use it. When we look at global south, many countries maintain neutrality, including India or Turkey, even NATO member like Turkey or Saudi and so on. So China is more confident that they can mobilize global south to their side. But more importantly, so Russia is proving from Chinese perspective that nuclear blackmail really work well against US. President Biden openly said, I think it was a big mistake, but openly said that US will not intervene Ukraine militarily because Russia is a nuclear power and we have to avoid nuclear exchange. That is a big mistake because China now believe that if China will blackmail the use of nuclear and then invade Taiwan if necessary, whether they are correct or not, they now assume that U.S. will not. It is very difficult for U.S. to intervene to Taiwan Strait. So that is the reason why, in past, since the Russian invasion, China further stepped up its nuclear buildup. So now China have, according to CEPA, now China have 500 nuclear warheads, increased by 90 within the past 1 year. And then, according to a Pentagon estimate, China will increase the number to 1,000 until 2030, and 1,500 until 2035, which is the same number that US deploys. So if in this process, I think, of course, I'm not saying that China will use force, but if I'm China, conventional forces, China has much more than US in the PACOM now. And if they believe that they can catch up on nuke, I think there is more room for China to behave more assertively in Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. I'm not saying it is attack, but the more bully military attitude.
Right.
Yeah.
The Biden administration made a point that they counted on China as a voice of reason to Russia to warn Russia off of using a nuclear weapon. That's what they said. But I guess, and then if Trump comes in, maybe the Chinese might be a little bit scared to wave the nuclear saber rattle. And then Harris, I guess it would probably be a focus on diplomacy. What is January 2025, what is the state of nuclear nonproliferation talks? Where does China fit into that? And who are the leaders on kind of getting those talks going? Well, let's say, Igor, do you want to start? Bobo, do you want to start?
I'll just be quick. I don't think China has any interest in nuclear non-proliferation talks. I think this has been the provenance of the U.S.-Russia relationship, and the Chinese have benefited greatly from that, partly for the reasons that Hiro described. Why would they want to be constrained in any way? They were not happy about the INF Treaty, because again, China acts in its own self-interest, but it benefits from some of the constraints that others have imposed on themselves. And this has been, frankly, the Republican criticism of New START Treaty and these other elements. They're almost automatic in U.S. We want to cut nuclear warheads and so forth, and China's been a beneficiary. So I don't really see, the administrations try to create a platform for those discussions. In some ways, I think the war in Ukraine has completely undercut that. And I really don't see that being the priority, frankly.
Are the Chinese, to questions? Oh. Just one quick follow-up and I'll go to the questions. Are the Chinese comfortable with nuclear buildup in North Korea and Iran as well?
Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah.
So, no, they're not. And if we're searching for a small crumb of comfort, at least the Chinese are now engaging in some kind of US-China dialogue on nuclear issues. Now, that's a very small crumb of comfort because in no way does that mean that they're prepared to discuss arms control in any sort of serious treaty sort of way. But they are worried about the nuclear build-up because, again, something that we underestimate about the Chinese is that, in a way, like the Americans, one of the few similarities perhaps that they have is that they do fundamentally want a stable international order. They want a different type of international order with different emphases and maybe different values, but they do cherish the idea of stability, whereas Russia, North Korea, Iran, I would argue, favor a much more disorderly environment. But can I just come back to the good and bad lessons of Ukraine? Because it is an important issue here.
And if you want to start raising hands, I'll take a look.
The Chinese initially were trying to balance between their commitment to some kind of stable international order on the one hand and keeping the Russians sweet on the other. But over the last couple of years, that has given way to a much more pro-Russian policy, and it's interesting to analyze why. I think there are fundamentally three reasons. The first is that the Russians are being seen to win in Ukraine on the ground, and the Chinese like to back a winner. The second issue is that the Chinese sense, and I think they're right in this, a weakening of Western resolve and unity. And the third, they also sense that the global South is increasingly irritated by what they see as the disproportionate focus and bandwidth on Ukraine to the detriment of other problems, such as debt relief, for example. And so that's one of the reasons. So the Chinese feel emboldened. They see the trends working in their favor, and therefore it's, the margin of risk has expanded for them.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, so first question will go to David Smith, and then I'll take a few questions at once.
Hello, David Smith of The Guardian. Thank you for this. Just interested in your thoughts on China's influence and investment in Africa, and has the US taken its eye off the ball there? Are we seeing African countries, there's a struggle between, are you going to be in the club of autocracies or the club of democracies there?
Okay, and then we'll go to Laura Thornton.
Actually, I'm going to piggyback off of that. We've seen the effectiveness of the Chinese tech stack in particular, whether it's infrastructure, underwater cables, telecommunications, surveillance equipment, and how it's being manipulated to undermine democracy. How serious do you see that threat? And also, what are some policies that can be effective to mitigate against it? Thanks.
Okay, and then there's a woman in tan, yes. Sorry, I'm making you guys run around. And then if you could just introduce yourself, please.
Hi, thank you very much for an incredible discussion. My name is Miriam. My question is about Chinese nuclear buildup.
Miriam, where are you from?
I'm from Georgia. I'm a student at Georgetown University in Washington.
Okay, welcome.
My question is about Chinese nuclear buildup. I do agree with you that I don't see China coming to the negotiating table about arms control anytime soon. However, there is a small, tiny area where they might be interested to talk to the US, which is the no first use policy. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. My second question is, we know that during the Obama administration, they retired the Tomahawk land attack missile, which was the last theater nuclear capability of the US in the Indo-Pacific. So my question is, do you think the existence of US theater capabilities in the Indo-Pacific sort of strengthens its extended deterrence commitments? Because we know that after the retirement of the systems, the weapon systems, Japanese officials, as well as officials in South Korea, were not necessarily happy about it. So.
Okay, and I'll take one more question. This gentleman in the blue suit. Sorry, Ambassador Freed. No. You could introduce yourself.
Yeah, Georgi Tumasian, Chairman of Armenian Community Platform of Georgia. China is very active in our region. As you know, China is building the Eurasia water line, which is connecting Caspian Sea to this Azov Sea, and then to the Black Sea. And actually, a lot of analysts think that that's main reason behind Russia's aggression, because that actually gives Russia full control over Azov Sea and then to the Black Sea. But as we see, Western approach is blocking actually this vital line, which is alternative for Singapore Strait for China in this region. But we also see that China has some other projects. In Georgia, we have strategic partnership document with China right now. And Azerbaijan also has a strategic partnership line. How West is approaching to block China's infrastructural invasion to our region, including not only to the Eurasia Channel, but in this Caucasus region as well. Thank you.
Okay. So do we want to start with Chinese investment and influence in Africa, to David Smith's question, and the challenge?
You want to go first?
No.
Okay. So China, Communist Party's DNA. Communist Party took power by surrounding city from the rural area. So Communist Party didn't surround big city, and then finally took power. So what they are doing is to penetrate into global south, like Africa or Middle East and Latin America, by investing their infrastructure and also build digital infrastructure, especially, as somebody asked, and then try to make them, try to mobilize their support, political, economic support, but also political support for China, or non-West system. So I think that, of course, there are backlash, like excessive debt and lack of transparency, but when I visit Africa, people say that China, Europe and US will come to invest to Africa, but it's very slow and not so much money, but a lot of preaches.
Exactly.
Preaches on the democracy. Yeah. But China comes quite often and drop a lot of money and no preach, no condition. So from this respect, from their perspective, unfortunately, China is more attractive in short term.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, just picking up on Hiro's points there, and I think he's absolutely right here. The biggest problem when the West engages with Africa, Global South more generally, is too much talking and not enough walking. There's a lot of talk about the rules-based international order, about the rule of law versus might is right. They criticize the debt trap diplomacy of China's Belt and Road Initiative. But they do not provide concrete alternatives. Or rather, they talk about them, but they do not deliver. So, for example, the G7 announced at their summit in Germany a couple of years ago, they announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, worth 600 billion. Well, where is this 600 billion? Because the Chinese may well under-deliver on the Belt and Road, they certainly do, but at least they deliver something. Whereas the problem with the West, which is far richer than China, they're not delivering anything, or at least that is the perception in Africa, but not just in Africa, across much of the global South. So, picking up Hiro's point, they get preached at, but where's the quid pro quo for getting preached at? And they don't see it. Whereas the Chinese at least, they have no illusions. But these are not naive countries and governments.
No, yeah.
You know, they recognize that the Chinese are incredibly exploitative, frankly, quite imperialistic in a 19th century sort of way. But ultimately, the Chinese are at least, as they see it, delivering something for minimum conditionalities.
And that's the challenge for democracies, is that it's very difficult to put up the money, because we have budgetary concerns, we have the concerns of the people, and autocracies can go ahead carte blanche. I
still think we can be much more generous. I think there's been a retrenchment in terms of human development assistance that is absolutely counterproductive to the interests of the West vis-a-vis China.
But with growing isolationist movements, I mean, how do you make that case that the U.S. or Europe that need to be more involved and put their money where their mouth is?
Well, we should be. Maybe I can take just two of the questions.
Yes.
Just to Laura's point, this is an absolutely critical point. China is walking around the world undermining democracy. This is a fact. And we have, so far, invested pretty modest means in countering that. There's a fund on the Hill, I think it's about 300 million globally. You know, China's the leading power that knows how to, you know, tools of subversion and surveillance and technology, judging by their own experience. This is something we need to prioritize and do more of globally. Miriam, to your point, you know, in the Pentagon, they have a term called the tyranny of distance, right? That applies to the Indo-Pacific. We have a long way to get to the fight. We need every tool we can get. So this is, not being a military expert, whatever weapons platforms we can prioritize for that, we should probably keep, given that China now enjoys an overwhelming conventional advantage. Again, going back to the nuclear point, I don't think they have any desire to self-constraint, even though some talks may be ongoing. But conventionally, if you look at a chart about where we were 20 years ago to where we were now, it's flipped completely 20, 30 years ago. This is a big problem for us. So it's a problem we need to think about strategically. And again, there's proposals out there that are pretty substantial, and I think they should be considered by the next administration and whoever it is in Congress, and I think they will be. So.
And we want to talk about what can be done about providing an alternative to Chinese investment in Georgia and the Caucasus, and what is the importance of being present here?
Well, we should be present. Again, we have not, given the collective sort of, ability we have not done that in a strategic way. We have some tools available. The DFC is one, the MCC is another. There's tools here. Have we done enough to counter? No, but should we be doing that dollar for dollar? No, probably not. We're not going to win that fight. We shouldn't be trying to do that. We should bring quality investments that are strategic in nature, and that emphasize the strength that we have. So, if the Chinese want to build a road, sure, we can say, well, have you considered others? But, if they want to build a road, they probably will build a road, and that's probably a good thing at the end of the day to have a road, So this is, I think that there's tools there, and we should emphasize and we should use them, and we have them, and we should use them in this region, and we shouldn't really, again, we shouldn't panic and try to go dollar for dollar and look at every Chinese investment as a strategic catastrophe for the United States, because that's not. I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Okay. Okay. Do we want to take some more questions? We're about 5 minutes. Okay. I'll go to Ambassador Fried, and then there's the gentleman in front of him, and then Batu. And I don't know if there's anybody in the. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
5 years or so ago, the consensus was China was economically triumphant and the sky's the limit. They've won. Now it's not so sure. Is China's economy under greater stress, and how does this affect your analysis of the strategic dynamics?
Okay. And then the gentleman right in front of you, Ambassador Fried, with the. And if you could please introduce yourself. Sorry, that was Ambassador Fried from the Atlantic Council, everyone.
Hello, thank you. My name is Yuri. I do represent McCain Institute alumni community. I'm Ukrainian. I have a question on the finance. So to this day, China still holds huge chunks of U.S. sovereign, debt. Yeah. And can it actually use it as a leverage in case of Taiwan, includingly? Thank you.
Okay. And Batu?
Hello, thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. Batu Kuteli, Atlantic Council of Georgia. I have actually two questions, very short one. First, you haven't mentioned Central Asia. Mm-hmm. And we've seen China has been ramping up some of its diplomacy with Central Asian countries, promising some investment. Recently, we've seen UK Foreign Secretary visiting all the Central Asian countries. European Union signing an agreement with Central Asian countries on critical minerals. So what's the gambit there, and where is the state of play? And the second, U.S. National Security Advisor just met with Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping's comment was that two leaders or two big countries have to work towards the world peace. And we anticipate, that was announced, that the President Biden will call Xi Jinping. So is there some new initiative or just strategic or tactical moves?
And we'll just take one more, and if we don't get to, there's a gentleman in the back with his hand up. If we don't get to answer all the questions, again, maybe everybody can discuss them at lunch. David, feel free to just cut me off because I know lunch is important.
Hi, Vlagalushka Open Society Foundations. I want to build up on Batu's question about Central Asia. Some of you said that China is improving its soft power. Do you still think there is a major flaw in their model, and it's similar to Russia's, which is it's relying really on elites? and we see it in Central Asia, is that it's buying a lot of elite influence. And because these elites are corrupt and China is very colonial, you know, there's so much public resentment that a lot of money just goes into sand. Thanks.
Thank you. And so if we can start with, is China's economy under greater stress, and can we bring it together with China having own U.S. sovereign debt, and can it use it as leverage?
So maybe go this order?
Whoever wants to, whoever's more excited about the question.
Okay. So for the sake of time, I will pick up Ambassador Fried's question on the economic aspect of China. So in Japan, as well as in Washington, there are two schools of thought. One school of thought is that China now shifting to declining power because of the demographic situation and also huge public debt problem and also lack of consumption and so on. So that is one school of thought, and they say that China will not be able to catch up with the US GDP permanently. But second school of thought is that no, China is just slowing down its economic growth, but still 3% or 5% is very, very high. So we should assume that China is rising gradually, and keep rising power. I think that in long run, first school of thought, declining power, theory is more relevant, but at the same time, when we look back history, declining empire is more dangerous. Declining empire is more unpredictable. Japan never attacked Pearl Harbor if Japan knew that Japan could wait for another 10 or 20 years, but Japan only had 2 years oil reserve, so time was not on the Japanese side, so they attack. So I think that as China is shifting to a declining power gradually, it doesn't mean that China will, I hope that China will become more benign, but if China believes that the time is not on their side, they want to review their timeline by which they want to achieve Taiwan unification and so on, and they will hurry up. So that is maybe another negative aspect that I have to.
So more risk than maybe opportunity.
Unfortunately, yeah, I think
yes.
so.
If we can go to the Central Asia question, China soft power, investment in critical minerals.
I'll just be very brief and then turn it over to Bobo, who may be more of an expert on this. I think Central Asia is a place where Russia and China, the no limits partnership will find its limits eventually. I think this is my one observation about sort of the alignment between Russia and China and where the rubber meets the road, and that will be Central Asia. We have an opportunity, and we can exploit that. So I'll just leave it at that, maybe.
Okay, yeah, so I just want to quickly address the flaws in the China development model. Yes, it's deeply flawed. It's too elite-centered, and I think this model could unravel over time. It's also nakedly imperialist. So when the Chinese build a road, they build a road from a Chinese-owned factory to the coast. You know, it's not there to benefit society, and this will have blowback over time. On Central Asia, it's encouraging that the UK, the EU, and other countries are starting to take a greater interest in not just Central Asia, but the global south. But it's not enough. Mere tokenism ain't going to cut it.
Yeah.
You have to be in it for the long haul, and you have to go big. Otherwise, it just looks pointless. You're still going to look terrible compared to the Chinese. On sovereign debt, the Chinese, it's all very well to take money from sort of US holdings, but where are they going to put it? Because all the other major currencies in the world are owned by US allies. So it's not that the Chinese have an alternative system. That's one of the reasons they're so committed to the international order, much as they slag it off. And on the Chinese economy, Dan Fried's comment, the Chinese economy is in big trouble, and I think it's in big structural trouble, so that although growth rates will be sustained for a little while, I can see, and there's a very good report by the Lowy Institute that talks about Chinese growth falling to as low as 2 to 3% by the 2030s and 2040s. By 2050, 1 in 4 Chinese will be over 65. So they have major economic and demographic problems. Now, this could cut 2 ways. It could encourage some strategic modesty, or it could encourage strategic panic. Better go while the going is still good. So it could make them more rather than less aggressive in Taiwan over the South China Sea. And as for the Blinken-Xi meetings, this idea of 2 big countries, I actually think that is the Chinese vision for international order. They see the world they see a new bipolar order in which big countries get to call the shots and little countries do as they're told.
Yes, okay. And and with that, we'll, hope for Georgia to not get swallowed up. Thank you, David.
Let's thank the panel and Laura for a great job. Thank you so much. Terrific.